Allegiance.
Pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. We remind those in attendance that if they wish to speak at the citizen comment period or public hearings, that they must sign up in the back of the chambers on the little table in sheets of paper. So with that, we'll move into item number 2, which is the consent agenda this evening. The first item is to look for an approval of that. Is there a motion to adopt the consent agenda as presented?
So moved.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Hestetter. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you, Ms. Anderson. Is there any discussion? All those in favor of adopting the consent agenda as presented, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries. Thank you. Number 3 would be matters from council members this evening. Is anybody have anything to share?
I'll give a brief update to attended the Parks and Rec Commission meeting the other day. It was last Thursday, I guess. And there's some exciting things happening over at Parks and Rec. We've talked before about the harvest dinner, I think, up at Sunset Park that they'll be announcing. They're helping the downtown Waynesboro group organize the Sip and Saunter, which is, I think, tomorrow night, and sold out very quickly.
Awesome.
There's lots of excitement about other programs going on, so it was a pleasure to be there and sort of get some updates on things, and looking forward to seeing that come to fruition.
Awesome. Great. Thank you. Anybody else have anything else? So I'll just add on that, piggyback a little bit, is that tomorrow, another exciting thing with Parks and Rec is we have the unveiling and ribbon cutting of the Teen Center over at Rosenwald at 4 o'clock tomorrow. So if folks are available and would like to go see this really neat resource for our community and our kids, would encourage those that can attend, please do so, and come help celebrate this new addition. Just a little bit, I attended the Central Shenandoah Planning District Commission's annual meeting last Monday. That was well attended over at the Stonewall Jackson, and got to learn a little bit more about the organization, and appreciated that. And apparently the new guy gets voted onto the executive committee, so I'm on the executive committee too. Mr. Allen and I had a productive brief meeting with the school division the other day with regards to the Waynesboro High School project. I'm pleased to report that things are advancing. I would have appreciated a little bit less rain. The roofing and the rain is not the easiest thing, but they are doing some exceptional work over there. We look forward to seeing that project move along. And then lastly, attended the Greater Augusta Chamber of Commerce Pig Pickin' and Politickin' meeting last Tuesday, which was really well attended. It was up in Weir's Cave, and appreciated the opportunity to be present and share all the exciting things going on in Waynesboro and with our General Assembly members as they prepare for, it's hard to believe, but as they prepare for the upcoming session.
I do have one more thing, Mr. Mayor.
Sure.
I forgot to mention, I actually got a chance to attend the Valley Alliance for Education. Or is it Valley Education Alliance? Anyhow, the folks that are behind a number of the awards for teaching, for Teacher of the Year, and the Dahlborn Awards and different things in the Valley, got to attend their reception that they noted their winners this year, including Mrs. Williamson, our own Teacher of the Year. But it was great education for me to meet the folks behind some of this, and the Board of Trustees that put those awards together and do the work to recognize those folks and give the grants to the teachers that are really trying to do some good things for our schools. So that was a good experience.
Wonderful, thank you. Number 4 this evening is a presentation on Waynesboro municipal finances, and I would just say, just as a little introduction before I hand over the reins to Mr. Shaw, is this is kind of an exciting topic. I know it can sometimes be a lofty and dry subject sometimes, but it's important that if we're going to continue to advance our city and make great strides and improvements and wise investments that we all understand, not just as elected leadership, but for the broader community to understand how municipal finances work. And so I really do appreciate the discussion this evening, and look forward to continuing the work into the budget season. So, Mr. Shaw.
Mr. Mayor, members of council, that's a great lead-in, actually. I'm under the impression that each of you ran for city council because you wanted to accomplish something. And I know that some of you wanted to improve a service in your neighborhood or the community at large. You want to advance goals of the comprehensive plan or pursue projects and programs that advance the community generally. Or you wanted to ensure the prudent and efficient use of city funds. And so as you pursue that work, I think you generally will find that some understanding of city finances, public finances, and the financial resources and condition of the city are important to you. So tonight I'll try to impart some basic information, baseline information. I know that will be familiar to at least some of you as to where our resources come from and how they're used and what's available to you as a council, the levers that you have financially. And then I'd also like to perhaps prompt some thinking relative to measures of financial health and how to put the decisions that you have to make into a larger context. I'm going to call this part one because inevitably in a discussion or a presentation that's this complicated, something's going to be left out. And so I apologize in advance if there was something that you hope to talk about. I would encourage conversation or questions as we go along. I certainly, if you would prefer to use this almost as a work session, then I'm prepared to do that as well. I'll do that at your pleasure. So Governing Magazine conducted a survey of local government officials, and they asked a series of questions. And as I go through these, you may make some mental notes or jot something on your iPad or shout out if you'd like. But they asked, local officials whether they knew their community's debt capacity, whether they knew how frequently their city assessed debt. They ask whether you spend half your time, as much as half your time, on city financial issues. They ask whether you think your city's long-term capital improvement plan is adequate. They ask whether or not you think that your city operates efficiently and effectively with the current funds that you have. And I think these are good questions to pose at this point in time to the Waynesboro City Council. And just as a sort of a matter of how other people stood, that it was interesting that folks said only about 20% of the folks said that they spent as much as half their time on city financial issues. And about 38% of the folks responded that they didn't think that their long-term capital improvement plan was adequate. And well over half felt like that they did not think that their city operated efficiently and effectively with their current funds. So I think the message is that some of the challenges that you face as an elected official in devoting your time to the issue and ensuring that those plans and that the efficiency of the government is adequate is a challenge that a lot of elected officials face. Just as a couple of points, in fact, that our legal debt limit is about $112 million right now, and that's essentially determined as 10% of the total taxable real estate value of your community. Now, having said that, we currently have debt of about $82 million total debt, and so the you're operating at a bit more than half of your legal debt limit. The legal debt limit doesn't necessarily reflect what you would find as affordable debt limit. So I think there's a good conversation to be had around what is the affordable debt capacity of the community. And I know as we look down the road at a second phase of the high school or other capital projects that you might like to pursue, this will become an issue of greater and greater urgency. We do assess the city debt at least annually. And in fact, just a couple of years ago, we did some bond reissues because it was advantageous to us in terms of reissuing bonds at lower interest rates than the original issue. One of the things that you'll find as you encounter local government finances in a conversation is that local governments are unique in the way that we account for our funds. And you'll hear us talk about the various funds of the city. And fund accounting really tries to segregate funds for specific purposes in accordance with various laws and regulations or special restrictions and limitations applied either through accounting practices. You'll hear us talk about the Governmental Accounting Standards Board, or GASB, or the local government itself, the funds that you as a city here in the city of Waynesboro have established. And as well, fund accounting really emphasizes accountability rather than profitability. And even the accounting methodology, the accrual methods, you'll hear us talk about modified accrual or cash accrual or full accrual, has to do with when revenues and expenditures can be recorded and recognized. The primary funds of the city include governmental funds, and these track the basic services of the local government. You'll hear us talk about the primary governmental fund being the general fund, and that's where you'll find public safety departments, the library, parks and rec, planning, zoning, economic development, the administration of the city, the financial administration of the city are all part of the general fund, and they're supported by various taxes and fees. We have fees for things like, whether it's to sign up for parks and rec programs, you have permits that are issued for buildings, and you have fees and fines that are levied at the court system. And while the general fund is the most prominent of the governmental funds, there are also other funds that are much smaller. Office on Youth, or CAPSAW, the animal shelter, is actually a governmental fund of the city, and the schools as a discrete component unit. Proprietary funds track governmental activities that operate like businesses, and you'll hear us talk about the enterprise funds, and those include the stormwater fund, the water and sewer funds, the garbage fund, and any internal services funds, fleet being the most prominent. And they charge fees for the services rendered, and they are self-supporting funds. They're self-balancing funds. And then finally, there are fiduciary funds, which are much smaller in our case, and these are funds where we hold funds as an agent for someone else. Payroll withholding, for instance, would be one of our fiduciary funds, and then we do also act as a fiduciary for some of the WAFAC monies that we provide to them. I posed the question. Again, you can make a mental note, write it down, or shout it out, but what is the total Waynesboro city budget? Some people are surprised to find out it's actually more than $100 million. And I think oftentimes, because when we talk about the budget, we're very focused on the general fund budget, which is about $52 million at this point. But the city budget also includes all of the enterprises. The city budget includes the school system. And the net budget of the city is actually about $90 million, because we transfer about $20 million a year across various funds. And so if you net out those interfund transfers, the net budget of the city is about $90 million. And the most talked about components of our budget tend to be the general fund, those tax-supported activities, the enterprise funds that I just ran through, which total about $13 million, and then finally the schools. And again, at $38 million, that is a component element of the city's budget. We actually share a bank account with the school system, and all of their funds run through our books. Here in Waynesboro, about three-quarters, a little more than three-quarters of the funds that are available for your use are raised locally. About 18% of the monies come from various state programs, most of which are categorical aid. They're funds that are specific to a particular use, like urban maintenance funds for the maintenance of roads and street, categorical aid to the library or police, categorical aid to the various constitutional offices, and then about 5% of the funds that we use come from federal sources, either entitlement grant funds or other types of federal grants, and then a much lower percentage of contributions from private entities. And I wouldn't say this is a bad thing, that local governments vary in terms of their dependence on sole source revenue. At least some observers would say that if you're more dependent on outside sources, then you are also susceptible to changes in larger economies or stresses from those larger sources at the state level, for instance. We certainly experienced that, and the school system experienced that through the recession, where state funds were heavily curtailed. Looking at the local general fund revenue, that is, as I say, the governmental funds, those tax and fee supported enterprises, that the biggest single source of revenue is the real estate property tax at about 40%. We also receive significant dollars from what's listed here as miscellaneous local taxes, which would include meals and lodging taxes, cigarette taxes, and the combined value of those taxes about $6 million. The sales tax provides about 14% of our general fund revenue, and that equates to a bit more than $5 million. Personal property, which are people's vehicles, trailers, boats, motorcycles, is a significant number for us as well. That's about 10%, and that's about $4 million in just taxing that personal property. Other property taxes include business personal property and the machinery and tools. Machinery and tools tax is at about $1 million a year in annual revenue. I think it's interesting to note that there was a time in Waynesboro not that long ago, in 15 years, maybe as many as 20, when sales and machinery and tools were really reversed, that we received about $5 million or so machinery and tools tax and about $1 million in sales, and that has flipped. I think one of the things that I would note is that for many observers, that you would rather have a higher dependence on real estate or real property taxes because it's a more stable source of revenue. As we saw again during the recession, that sales tax, meals and lodging tax are susceptible to fluctuations in the economy. Now, there are some folks that would say in an inflationary time, really those taxes tend to keep pace better with the growing cost of government. The goods and service cost us more, and that folks don't curtail their spending habits as much during inflationary periods as they did during a recessionary period. But nonetheless, for most local governments, real estate is king. It's stable, it's fairly easy to understand and administer. The tough thing is that people really don't like it that much, and I know that this is a dilemma for most local government officials, and that some of the beef is that we may need to generate additional revenues. We do that through raising the real estate tax rate, but people's income didn't necessarily go up to match that. And so it's, again, this isn't a dilemma that's unique to us in Waynesboro. It's a fairly common one. Just as to note that after the last two budget seasons, where we did increase real estate tax rates primarily to fund the high school renovation project and some other needs of the public school and municipal government, our real estate tax rate is now at 93 cents per $100 of valuation. And that's still below the state average, which hovers a bit more than $1 per $100 of valuation for Virginia cities. If we turn our attention then to expenditures, and how is it that we use the resources that are available to us, you'll find that if we look at all funds, the enterprise funds, general fund, and so forth, that the enterprise funds account for about 13% of our total expenditures. The other general fund operation, about 36%, and the school system, including debt, more than 42%. Much smaller expenditures in debt service at about 1%. Special revenue funds include things like our contribution to the Virginia Public Assistance programs, the Comprehensive Services Act that are administered by the Department of Social Services, Office on Youth, and some of those activities. If we turn our attention strictly to the general fund, our contribution, again, to the school system at almost 30%, is the biggest single expenditure. Public safety is next at about 23% of the general fund activity. Public works operations, which include the streets division, which is almost entirely state supported. We utilize the urban maintenance program is at about 13%. But that also includes the landfill post-closure operations, the engineering department of public works, and the administration of public works generally. General government administration includes certainly the city manager's office, the human resources, financial administration, those kinds of things. Much smaller expenditures on things like community development at about 2%. Debt-related expenditures at about 3%. As I mentioned earlier, our local debt has climbed to about $82 million. Now, the biggest single source of debt or use of debt is for public school renovation projects, and these are projects that include not only the recent borrowing for the Waynesboro High School, but a prior borrowing for the high school. We're still paying off Kate Collins debt service. We still have a little ways to pay off on the Westwood Elementary School renovation of some years ago. The general fund debt is other general fund debt is a little more than $8 million. A good share of that has been utilized for stormwater projects that the City Council pursued over the last decade or so. The Wayne Hills stormwater pond, being a notable renovation, but in fact, we've been working through a number of the top 10 capital improvement projects on our stormwater CIP pretty steadily. Then the sewer fund carries about $27 million of debt, a little bit more than $27 million of debt, and the water fund carries about $10 million, almost $10.5 million of debt, primarily for the construction of a water filtration plant that opened in 2010.
Jim, could you give spend a little more time on that $8.1 million? I'm sorry, I might have missed it because I was still in awe over the other $37 million, but spend a little more time on the 8.1. What sort of is in that category?
A lot of that is stormwater projects that prior to establishing stormwater as an enterprise, that the stormwater debt was carried in the general fund. So
that was 2008 or so, 2009?
There were a couple of borrowings. So there was a 2008 borrowing, and then there was a subsequent borrowing in 2010 that were Build America bonds. And then just a couple of years ago, we borrowed about $800,000 that we matched with an $800,000 grant for the Madison, Ohio pond. There are also some big bridge projects. Both the Broad Street Bridge project is included in that borrowing. But those tend to be the biggest in that particular fund. I think there may be a fire engine in there as well.
Mm-hmm. I'm trying to think of ways that we could help people because it's, we'll get this presentation in about 3 months. All of us will kind of glaze over it, and I can only imagine those at home and when they receive their $40 bill in the mail and how to relate that the reason you see these costs, the reason you receive these fees is associated with the debt. The debt doesn't go away from one year after the next. It's still there, and we'll be paying for it for some time. And it'd be interesting to see if there's, I don't know, I'll stew on a little bit, see if anybody else has any ideas of ways that we might be able to just kind of re-communicate that to folks, is that it's, we're all in this together for the long haul. It's not a one and done.
Well, most of these debt issues are 25-year issues. There are some 20-year, there are some that are 30-year, but most of them are 25-year issues. And quite a bit of the debt that you see here has been issued since, as you say, 2007, 8, 2010 borrowings. And a lot of work done on the, on the utility side under various types of consent orders. But as well, I think there was a commitment on the part of councils to try to improve infrastructure, and especially addressing, not to be redundant, but stormwater projects.
Yeah. Thank you.
We're already thinking about the budget season here. And I came across this, actually I think Mr. Jude forwarded me this quote that, and I think it's apt, that the truth about a city's aspirations isn't found in its vision, it's in its budget. And I think one of the frustrations that folks have when they enter onto council, or probably the governor Virginia, who takes over somebody else's budget, is it takes time then to work these new programs, projects, into the city's budget cycle. And it's always a harsh reality. I tell folks that we work with here, the department heads, that I'm always most optimistic about the budget about November. And then as you start to dig into what's available for us to spend and all of the various needs that we have, that reality starts to sink in. That the things, your aspirations, have to find their way into the budget. I've outlined the budget cycle, and I think this graphic is fairly apt, because really it is something that parts of the budget cycle are continuous. And I would start at the top with strategic planning, and that's an ongoing process, certainly for the department heads here. I know that already there are folks who are thinking about restructuring their departments or new programs that they would like to pursue, or compensation in their departments and those types of things. What are going to be the strategies that we will try to have reflected in the upcoming budget? But we begin that process in earnest at about this time, but it's an ongoing one. And I would say, and I would encourage the council really to also enter into that strategic planning phase very soon. And hopefully, as we look forward to the 2020 budget, that the council will start to think about some sort of strategic planning exercises, hopefully this fall, October, November, so that then we can take your desires, your aspirations, and plug them into departmental budgets. The department's budgets begin preparation in October. We generally open what we call the budget levels in our information system, and folks can start to key their budgets. November and December, though, the budget work is underway in earnest, and the department's budgets are generally due by the end of the year, the end of December or the 1st of January. We'll begin revenue forecasting pretty seriously by December, and then we continue to shape up revenue forecast as the budget process unfolds. But certainly by December, we like to have some sense of what we think the revenue picture for the city is going to look like. And again, that's something of an ongoing process. We track especially the volatile revenues pretty closely, and then as well, we like to know that we've received the larger revenues, tax revenues, and those things as we would expect. By January, executive preparation begins, and so what happens is the 1st of January, the budget levels are closed to the departments. The finance department puts together a summary budget for the city manager, myself, the finance director, the assistant finance director, form a budget committee, and then it takes us usually 2 or 3 months to prepare a budget for the city council to review. And so then legislative review begins according to the city code. We have to deliver, the city manager has to deliver a budget to council by the first Monday in April. Through April and early May, public hearings are held on any changes in tax rates or water and sewer fees, and then the budget itself. And then generally by late May or June, the budget is adopted. And you actually have until the fourth Monday in June to adopt your budget. That puts the treasurer and the commissioner of revenue in kind of a bind in trying to establish tax rates. And typically, budgets have been adopted much earlier here. And then we're into execution, and that is, again, an ongoing activity.
One thing that I just kind of note in that schedule is when the school division makes its request to council, and as a follower of the budget cycles for a few years, I mean, every year they come up and they say, well, these are all preliminary numbers because the General Assembly inevitably has not completed their work, and so I felt, at least particularly in the last couple of years, ill-informed and ill-prepared to really sort of understand the context of what their request really is, because there's a big piece of the pie, of the puzzle, hasn't sort of materialized yet. And I know that the reason that they do that is because our city charter says that. I would just offer, I would be interested in having that conversation of, are we unique in that comparatively to when we have a school superintendent or comparative cities? Do they all have to march out in the middle of March and give a presentation to their city council or whatever it is? Or are we different? And if we are different, maybe that's, I know we're kind of have a list. Ms. Michelson's been putting a list together of potential charter conversations. And I just think it doesn't really do anybody any favors by having incomplete information.
So I think a couple of observations, one being that we certainly have the ability to request that the school system furnish their request sooner. I would say they're going to be challenged, much like we are, to deliver an informed or complete request sooner in the budget cycle. But that's certainly an option that the community can work out and discuss according to its own priorities and preferences. I don't think there's much to be done about prodding the General Assembly to complete their work. And so what my view is, in my experience, is that we know generally where they're going to land, and I wouldn't make light of the fact that $70,000 to $170,000 makes a big difference to Dr. Castle and the school system. There would be big and important decisions associated with the swing of that magnitude. But what are you going to do? I think my view has been we all do the best we can with the information we have. Certainly our information, I would assert, is in pretty good shape at that point. And then when the General Assembly figures out what they're going to do, we amend and adjust midstream. But I think that the opportunity that we have is to engage with the school system a little earlier in the process, but allow that, they really are waiting on probably more than 50% of their budget coming from the state, and so they need good numbers. The other observation I would make that unlike the state, the city council hires the executive branch of government. So the city manager doesn't develop an independent or competing list of budgetary priorities. I certainly have the responsibility to identify what I think is important, or reflect what the staff has identified as important to the organization. But if we're doing a good job in working collaboratively, and I'm doing a good job of being attentive, that executive preparation ought to make the legislative review piece much easier. We have difficulty when either an elected body doesn't communicate or an executive doesn't listen, and you end up in March with a surprise that I didn't think this was going to look like that.
Right.
Much more work to do in about 2 months' time, as opposed to if we can iron out any wrinkles and collaborate on priorities in October and November and December, that last 2 to 3 months of the budget process go much more quickly.
Yeah, and it could work with, some of the 2-on-2 conversations that we've had having, or maybe something more formal in joint work sessions with the school board. But to have them as part of the strategic planning process, I think, is important, because at the end of the day, the $82 million of debt that we look at is their $82 million of debt. I mean, there's only so much a community of our size can accomplish, and engaging them early, I think, helps manage expectations. You can still be aspirational,
Right.
but all within the context of trying to strike the right balance of investments. So.
One of the topics we discussed periodically is fund balance and the use of fund balance. And simply stated, fund balance is the accumulated excess of assets over liabilities on a balance sheet, or what may be referred to as surplus. And fund balance that the council commits for certain specific purposes are oftentimes called reserves. So you'll hear us talk about fund balance, or what we have in our reserve. And fund balance is, for the most part, available for the use of at the council's discretion. And fund balance tends to be one of the key measures of financial health and stability. It's a key measure, and it's not only the fund balance value itself, but the way that councils over time administer the use of fund balance and have policies specific to the use of fund balance is a key issue for either state agencies that provide us grants and funding, or for bond agencies and rating agencies. And fund balance is divided into 5 distinct categories. At the top of fund balance would be what would be considered unspendable funds. That might include either inventory that's not in a spendable as a liquid asset, or in our case, the perpetual care fund of the cemetery, that we've made an agreement as we've sold cemetery lots that there would be a trust established, and we would only spend the interest earned from the trust and not the corpus itself. And then restricted fund balance includes those funds that come to us from some outside source that can only be used for explicit purpose. And as I mentioned earlier, VDOT urban maintenance funds come with the restrictions that VDOT attaches to the use of those funds strictly for the maintenance of roads and bridges. But we also receive categorical aid for police and for courts and for the sheriff's department, treasurer, other constitutionals, and those funds are segregated and considered restricted. Unrestricted funds are comprised of 3 different types of fund balance. One would be committed reserves, where, and I'll show you in a second, where the council has established reserves in anticipation of capital spending or spending for a specific purpose or for revenue stabilization. Assigned fund balance is the part of fund balance that's been appropriated and is assigned then to the manager for operations. And then the unassigned fund balance are those funds that have not been assigned or otherwise committed. This council several years ago adopted a fund balance policy that said that the unassigned fund balance should equal 110% of 2 months' worth of operating expenditures, and it basically provides operating capital for the city. And then as well, the fund balance policy states that fund balance should only be used for one-time or capital expenditures and not to be used to fill gaps in your operating budget with recurrent uses, or for recurrent uses. This is the general fund balance, and I show this as a matter of showing how it's fluctuated over the last 5 or 6 years or so. And from about $15 million, it dips into the $14 million range. It peaked in 2016 at over $16 million. And again, this includes both restricted and unrestricted fund balance. And the question might arise as to what causes the fluctuations in fund balance. Part of the answer lies in the fact that we budget the use of fund balance, that in each budget year, we plan to use fund balance at the outset of the budget. And as you can see, typically, it's around $1 million, sometimes more, sometimes slightly less. But we typically plan on taking $1 million out of the bank and using that money for various capital needs of the city. That can be buying police cars, it can be doing building maintenance, it can be buying information systems for the city. As well, fund balance can be appropriated throughout the year, and sometimes the council has established reserves that then we come to you and ask to be used throughout the year. And so if you look at the annual use of fund balance, it can be in some years a bit more, even quite a bit more than the $1 million that's originally budgeted. The other thing to bear in mind is that if you carry an encumbrance from one year into the next, then that is essentially reduces your available fund balance. It's encumbered, and so the fund balance will be reduced by that amount. So a good example, if I go back to this period, we entered into a large project to replace the city's computer information systems at the end of 2016. And so we had saved fund balance for that project, and as soon as we entered into the agreement and signed about a $1.6 million contract, we created a purchase order, and that became an encumbrance on fund balance. And so fund balance was reduced by that amount in addition to whatever else the council had budgeted for the use of fund balance. This can be a confounding concept, fund accounting, in that there are years where we actually, that again, the period 2016 to 17, the city actually had greater revenues than budgeted, less expenses than budgeted, and so you would think, well, you should have a surplus, and that would have been the case, but that we had planned use of fund balance that exceeded even that savings. I apologize for the quality of the graphic here. I'll point out a couple of key things. On the left here are the various committed reserves that have been established by the City Council. We have an economic development reserve. We have a couple of reserves that were established when the health department moved to their current location. There's a small library book reserve that was from proceeds of late fees that was brought over some years ago from a private bank account. We established a technology reserve several years ago in anticipation of the replacement of the computer systems, and we've continued to use the remains of that reserve for other types of computer-related expenditures. We set aside money for the Augusta County Service Authority landfill operation. We're a partner in that operation. We anticipate that the day will come that a cell at the landfill will be closed, new cells will be opened, and we'll be asked for an exceptional contribution towards that capital. Then two of the key reserves that we talk about are governmental equipment replacement and governmental facility maintenance reserves. And again, these are two of the committed reserves that are most frequently used by the City Council, either at budget time or throughout the year. Going into to the budget cycle, the former finance director and the budget committee, myself included, felt like we needed to have those reserves at about $500,000 going into the budget cycle, and that we wanted to maintain those reserves at something more than $200,000. We have about a $500,000 revenue stabilization reserve. Then we also are receiving money from a buy-in agreement at the Middle River Regional Jail. Some years ago, the jail authority borrowed money, and we pay back our portion of that borrowing for the construction of the jail itself. Rockingham County, Harrisonburg bought into the jail capacity a couple of years ago, and the agreement was that the city of Waynesboro and our partners would be paid back. We receive about $635,000 a year over a 10-year period. And then finally, 2 years ago, the city council set up a school debt reserve that is basically where we've taken portions of the money that was generated from new tax revenue and set it aside for debt service. A quick comment that I would make is just simply, as you look at these reserves, these reserves can only be used at the discretion of council, and that they are used at your full discretion. Now, having said that, we encourage the council, and we talk to, at budget time and other times, about taking care of the reserves, because we know that there are looming expenditures, or we have concerns that we are able to react in case there is an economic downturn, or that there's some unexpected expenditure that we have to react to. Having said that, again, the council could reorder these. I would encourage that a future conversation should be had around what the levels of these reserves really ought to be, and what is done if you fall below those levels. So in other words, in some communities, they say that capital reserve should stay at $500,000. If it drops below $250,000, the finance director has to come back with a plan to replenish the reserve. And so and that usually means that you budget for the replenishment of the reserve. I would also note that we have about $500,000 in revenue stabilization. I've seen some communities that will try to establish that reserve at more like 10% or 15% of whatever your operating budget is. And especially having gone through a recession, I can see the wisdom of having a greater reserve. And then we also have, outside of the general fund, we call it the 410 fund, is a fund that is set up basically to run capital projects that are not in the utility programs. The council has about $750,000 set aside. Governing Magazine also did a survey, and it asked local elected officials what they thought the biggest threats to their community's financial health were. And I paused to let you contemplate what you think the biggest threats to the financial health of the city of Waynesboro are. Shout out if you like, otherwise make a mental note. But the respondents to the survey felt like, one, that infrastructure cost, that was the greatest single response, was that the growing cost of infrastructure, replacing water and sewer facilities, bridges, roads, those types of things. And as we've seen here, sometimes you have little choice. That we have operated under a consent order through the State Water Control Board for nearly 2 decades, and you're well aware, to fix problems with leaky sewer pipes, basically, and an aging sewage treatment system. And so those expenditures were not at our choice, and the cost of those expenditures have been passed along to consumers through the sewer fees. As well, a couple of years ago, we were designated as an MS4 community, and that's basically a small municipal separate stormwater sewer system. And under the Clean Water Act, we basically have to have a permit for all of the discharges from the various stormwater pipes in the city. And so it really stepped up the regulation of that system and the cost of managing the system. So oftentimes those infrastructure problems are ones that we have little choice about responding to. And if you read, any of the literature, you're going to find out that aging infrastructure is really an American problem and not just a Waynesboro problem. Another top threat for a lot of local elected officials is insufficient revenue. Where will money come from to be able to fund the necessary services and programs and projects of government? And as noted, that there is certainly some reluctance on the part of taxpayers and fee payers to have the price of government increased. And then finally, personnel cost. And, as we see year to year, we've just been sitting recently with our health insurer and talking about insurance. And, we continue to work through the Virginia retirement system with their various programs and the responses they're trying to make in making sure that the retirement system of the Commonwealth of which we're a participant is stable and solid. And personnel costs generally, we've talked about the fact that we're in a very competitive labor market. We have higher than acceptable turnover rates in a lot of areas. And that part of the issue is just being able to pay a competitive and attractive wage and offer benefits, not only health insurance benefits and retirement benefits, but training and other types of benefits to an employee base. So then I would say let's turn our attention to maybe how we think about financial health and the stability of Waynesboro's finances. And I think over time, and especially as you look to big projects, as you look to pursuing new programs of the city, we want to take it in the context of, what is financial health? How do we determine financial health? And some people would say that it's really a combination of several factors, one being financial position, and that is basically that you have cash on hand, other liquid resources available, so that you don't have to either borrow money or delay payments or liquidate some other asset in order to meet your financial obligations. Financial performance would simply stated be that year in, year out, your revenues exceed your expenditures. And in the private sector, this might be called profitability. It's obviously more complicated for us because we don't necessarily strive to make a profit. And so we also offer services for which people don't pay fairly, there are, I don't mean to use the term disparagingly, but there are free riders in a system of government. There are people who pay less for services provided than somebody else who's paying more in their taxes, and that's just the nature of government finance. And as well, the cost that people spend on clean air, for instance, is enjoyed by everybody, no matter how much they actually contributed towards the cost of pollution control. So financial performance, again, might be considered profitability, but profitability is harder for government to basically define. And then finally is solvency. And solvency is just the ability to pay bills as they arrive. And we usually talk about cash solvency as being, that 60 to 90 days term that you can make payroll, you can pay vendors, you can make payments on debt and those types of things. Long-term solvency really is the ability to generate revenues that you will need to cover the debt service that we discussed earlier for those 20 and 25 and 30-year borrowings. So then a question arises as to, well, how do you measure these things? And there are various measures, and I'm going to show several examples with the caveat that I've seen some very sophisticated models where people will use 10 different measures for each one of these categories. And the reason that you would want to use more than one measure is that a single measure might either mask a problem or exaggerate a problem, doesn't tell the whole story. And so by using multiple types of measures, you're able to get at, what is financial performance, what is solvency, and what is financial position. But financial performance, one simple measure, is just the growth in your net assets. And net assets are simply your total assets minus your total liabilities. And so I've shown here the growth in net assets over the last 10 years or so, both the general fund and then the enterprise funds. And you'll note that the enterprise funds tend to be larger in terms of net position because they're very capital intensive. The sewage treatment plants, water treatment plants, all of the infrastructure that goes with those systems is very capital intensive. So we've had certainly growth in net assets over a period of time, which would indicate healthy financial position. Solvency in this measure is simply cash to current liabilities, and it's a quick ratio. In fact, it's often referred to as the quick ratio in trying to determine whether you have enough cash on hand to meet the looming current liabilities. And so what you would hope for is that the ratio is cash divided by current liabilities. So you want to have more cash than current liabilities, and that would be 1-to-1 would mean you have an equal amount of cash. As you have more cash than current liabilities, the ratio gets higher. And so as you can see in the enterprise funds, there's been some fluctuation, and in the general fund as well, but they've trended downward in recent years. And why might that be? Part of it is taking on liabilities for which you're not matching with cash. Having payments that you didn't raise additional revenues to cover. And then finally, one measure of financial position would be the general fund fund balance as a percentage of that year's expenditures. So if you recall those, that our fund balance tends to be in the neighborhood of $14 to $16 million. If your budget has been in the neighborhood of anywhere from about $40 to $50 million, and you're dividing that fund balance by the total budget, what you're saying is that there's a relationship between the money you have in the bank and the expenditures that you're taking on. Even though you don't intend to pay for all those expenditures with fund balance, you're recognizing that there is some relationship between the two. And again, I would say we've held fairly steady, maybe a little downward trend. And again, I would stress that there's no perfect number, that you're not really trying to hit a goal as much as you're trying to understand your trends over time. And then the other thing that some folks do is try to find comparison communities, that if you can find communities that are about the same population, have similar service needs, and have similar sized budgets, then you might want to use them as a comparison. And I've seen, some folks use as few as 10 total measures of financial health, and I've seen large communities where they're tracking 30 different measures. I think this would be a topic I'd certainly recommend that the council, maybe a finance committee of the council, explore with the finance staff over the coming years to say, well, let's start to put together some relevant measures that we can track, because I think it's in the past we've talked to finance committee about a quarterly report, and that's a good thing to do. However, you've got a professional staff that's tracking expenditures and revenues on a quarterly basis, and I think as a council, it would be important to take the longer view, to take the larger view of your financial position, your financial health. Another thing I think that you can do to help safeguard your financial health is to think about establishing a greater number of financial policies. And the council has established, for instance, a general fund reserve policy, and I spoke of that earlier. But there are also fairly simple statements to be made about your operating budgets, capital budgets and planning, long-term financing, certainly debt policies and investment policies. And the policies I've seen tend to be large, broad goals, and not necessarily ones that are detailed. You're looking for policies that are relatively enduring so that as subsequent councils come on board, they're inheriting basic standards for good stewardship of the public's funds. And so, and some of these, I would say, are ones that we certainly could quickly give you samples and develop in-house. Others, like a debt policy, might be one that you would turn to financial advisors to help with. And then some advisable policies, as you work through the ones that are essential, would be revenue and expenditure policies, accounting and auditing and reporting policies, internal control, risk management policies, economic development policies, and procurement. You've recently addressed procurement, and we have internal procurement policies here at the city. We've worked with Greg Hitchin to have an economic development policy, but we would ask that perhaps those things should be endorsed by the council. Some of your revenue policies could be quite simple. For instance, making a decision that where fees are concerned, you would like the users of services to the greatest extent possible pay for those services. In other words, if you look at the operation of a cemetery and you would say, well, we are basically subsidizing through tax dollars the operation of that cemetery, and we believe that folks should pay for that service through a more realistic fee. That's the type of thing that a revenue policy tries to address. And then as well, you look at accounting, auditing, financial reporting. What I've seen in a lot of localities is simply that the locality is going to abide by GASB rules, which we do, that you're going to assemble your books and report in a manner consistent with the Commonwealth's Auditor of Public Account that we do, and that you might be seeking GFOA, Governmental Finance Officers Association, certificates of excellence for your financial reports, the budget and the CAFR, and that those would be, again, things that seem obvious, but they start to establish baselines for good management of the financial resources of the community. They communicate to citizens, to creditors, to agencies that we depend upon our financial strength and the seriousness with which we take the financial health of the city. I'm going to wrap up with what I would say. This is perhaps a little editorializing on my part. Mr. Hamp and I have talked about where we think some of the key concerns right now for city finances would be. One of the most immediate things is finishing out the 2018 year-end audit. That, as you're aware, we've talked about it quite a bit, that we've been replacing the city's system-wide computer system, all of financial systems. We knew going into it that it would be about a 2.5 to 3 year project, and we're on target. However, we end up operating in two systems. So in 2018, we've collected revenues in two different computer systems. We've paid bills in different computer systems. We've made payroll in two different computer systems, and the same for the schools. And so completing the audit is quite complicated. The audit cost a bit more last year than it typically does, and I would expect the same this year. But the effort on the part of the finance staff and the auditors is pretty extensive and unusual. Another issue is looking at the school funding formula. That the way our funding formula works is that we provide the schools 42.5% of the discretionary revenues according to the most current audit. The way that works is you're basically always in a 2-year lag. The 2018 fiscal year ended in June. We'll have an audit for 2018 by the end of November, and that audit for 2018 will establish school funding for the budget year 2020. 2018 was the first year the City Council raised the real estate tax rate in order to establish a debt fund for the high school renovation project. So if we applied 42.5% to those earmarked revenues, then the city is going to have to replace that value. And so it starts to undermine the funding formula. I would also note that just generally speaking, the funding formula has served us well for a long time. I think that administrators, at least, and perhaps elected officials, like the certainty of the formula. But there are many reasons to revisit the funding formula, one being the changes and fluctuations in school populations or school demographics, changing capital needs of the schools. The funding formula doesn't take into account any of the capital needs of the schools. I think one of the challenges with the formula as it's drawn is that it doesn't smooth out fluctuations in revenues of the city, either high or low. The schools can be at an advantage or disadvantage because of those fluctuations. And so there are good reasons, I think, to work through with the school board a revised funding formula. We immediately, and we've mentioned before, turning our attention to the 2020 budget preparation. And I think that the council, we're looking to the council for some guidance. And I think when I recognize the frustration on the part of council folks who receive a budget at the end of March and then are expected to adopt it in a very short period of time, well, part of that frustration is born of not having participated in the budget preparation early enough. And so, again, not to become redundant, but we're really encouraging council perhaps through the upcoming months of the fall to help us and to understand what your priorities are. And as a council, it's not important necessarily for you to understand where every penny in that budget goes. There's $90 million of pennies, and that's a lot for anybody to track. What is important is for us all to understand that your priorities are reflected in the budget, that the budget is a reflection of the priorities, as you see it, of the community at large. I think that would be prove some great success if at the next budget presentation, the city manager's budget, we start with how the budget is reflective of the priorities of council, specific priorities of the council. And then, as I mentioned, I think that as we look forward, I believe at least that establishing more firm financial policies over a broader range of topics and then establishing a system for measuring financial health are important activities and perhaps ones that a finance committee of the council would like to take on. Mr. Mayor, that's all I have.
We appreciate it very much. Anybody have any questions for Mr. Shaw? Awesome. Well, thank you very much. This is very well done, and I'm thankful that it will be out on YouTube that we can share away. So, let's see. Next this evening is number 5 on the agenda is to consider approving a request by the Waynesboro Kiwanis Club to close portions of Main Street and Wayne Avenue on Wednesday, October 31st, 2018, from 2:30 p.m. until 6 p.m. to hold the annual Halloween trick-or-treat trail and costume contests. Mr. Ham.
So ordinarily, I have the authority to close the streets, and I would say in this case, rather than sharing that authority, because it's in the downtown central business district and because retail activity and restaurant activity has increased in recent years, I'm simply alerting you to my attention to do this, and unless I hear grave concern, you're just simply advised that I plan to do this. This is an annual event. It's well attended, and we appreciate the leadership offered by the Kiwanis Club to organize the event.
considering there's quite a bit of downtown merchant participation in it each year. I think it's such an enjoyable event, and I think the reason we're doing the closure, if I recall, was at the advice of our police department, and out of concern for public safety and children sort of darting between cars and alike.
That's correct. It is a well-attended event.
Okay, great. So you don't need a motion or anything for that?
Sure.
Awesome. Thank you. Item number 6 is to consider approving an application from the Parks and Recreation Department for permission to serve alcoholic beverages on public property in association with the Harvest Center to raise funds for and promote awareness of the proposed Sunset Park.
So this is the second year of the event that we conducted last year, pardon me, and because the part of the program is to includes beverage alcohol, I would ask that council authorize the service and consumption of beverage alcohol on public property.
Is there a motion to authorize serving alcohol on public property?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Is there any discussion? All those in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries. Number 7 on the Planning Commission, just talked with some colleagues. I think we're going to defer that to the next meeting, Mr. Hamp.
Okay.
Do appreciate we've had a plethora of applicants, so which is exciting, and so we want to make sure that we provide enough of an examination for those applicants, so appreciate that. Number 8 is to consider reappointing a member to a 3-year term and consider appointing a candidate to the Regional Youth Commission for a 3-year term of September 1st, 2018, ending August 31st, 2021. Mr. Hamp.
Yes, sir, Mr. Mayor. Kelly Spotlow Durrett is is the individual who seeks appointment for their first term, and Mr. Peter Van Acker is the individual who's eligible for reappointment.
Any opposition to maybe doing these at the same time? Okay. Is there a motion to approve those appointments?
I'll make that motion.
Okay, Mr. Allen, thank you. Is there a second?
I'll second.
Anderson, appreciate it. Is there any discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries unanimously. Thank you. Item 9 is to consider reappointing 2 members, each for a 4-year term, to the Waynesboro Redevelopment and Housing Authority Board. Mr. Hamp.
So again, both individuals are reappointments, Ms. Marianne Everly and Mr. Christopher Musera.
Thank you. Is there a motion to reappoint the applicants, these individuals?
I'll make the motion.
Mr. Allen, is there a second?
Second.
Dr. Hastler, is there any discussion? All those in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries. Thank you. Number 10 is to consider introducing an ordinance appropriating $29,174 of insurance proceeds to the general fund for flooring replacement at the police department. Mr. Hamp.
Are there any questions, or is the ordinance self-explanatory?
It's a big, quite the flooding event over there.
So we had that exceptional rain event, I think it was in July. We've submitted a claim to the insurance company. They've confirmed the eligibility to pay the claim. In keeping with our theme tonight, the council actually has to appropriate the receipts from the claim in order for us to use that. And so we'll be replacing the carpet and continuing and what's the proper term, sort of a imitation hardwood surface through the balance of the department. The chief is here. I would like to recognize that through either good fortune or misfortune, however, I guess whatever shoes you're wearing at the time, the department was conducting some training with reserves, and so there was an exceptional number of individuals who were available to help mitigate the flooding by moving papers, computers, furniture, shop backing, et cetera. So our department does a terrific job of going above and beyond, and they really went above and beyond on this particular evening. They probably saved the city some money in that regard because they applied their own labor to the problem. I'll alert you to the notion that we've solicited a quote to mitigate or prevent this occurrence from occurring in the future. It's actually, we've had 2 flooding episodes in the last 6 or 8 years, and we've gotten a quote to do 3 things. One is to install a sump pump system, the second to do some flood proofing and install a floodgate. What happens is, if you're at all familiar with the Gorsuch building, on the front of the building there is a window well that extends around the front and about a quarter of the way down, or maybe even more, half the way down on the side. Drains for that are sometimes clogged, or in this case, become overcharged with the volume of water the system can't handle. And so we've identified a solution, and I'll be back to council to affect that and appropriate funds from the building maintenance.
Great, thank you. Is there a motion to introduce the ordinance?
So moved.
Ms. Anderson, is there a second?
Second.
Ms. Anderson, is there any discussion? All those in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries. Moving on to number 11, communication correspondence calendar. Mr. Hamp.
So a couple of items for this evening. The first being a reminder that on September 6th, the Economic Development and Economic Development Authority, our Economic Development Department and our authority will conduct our 3rd pitch night, which is an element of the Grow Waynesboro program. This is kind of an exciting program. I think there's a growing energy and enthusiasm around the opportunity, and it's a bit of a Shark Tank type experience where the candidates present their business ideas and business plans, and then those presentations and work that has been conducted previously are evaluated, and they are eligible to receive some grant money that's provided by the locality. And it's intended to promote small business development, investment, and employment in the community, and we've had some success with that program. At the previous meeting, Mr. Short prompted me to furnish an update on 3 items: the status of the Community Development Department, the status of initiatives to enhance enforcement for inoperable and abandoned vehicles, and then the status of the Citizens Academy or Citizens University. It was my intention to avail myself. I think the guidance I received was either the next meeting or the next meeting after that. I was going to use the entirety of that period to complete my assignment, but Mr. Short prompts me to give some report in the interim. So in reverse order, the Citizens Academy, part of what I need to do as a manager is to prioritize and apply resource, whether that's space resource, financial resource, or staff resource, to known priorities and known initiatives, and also ones that we encounter that were not part of any, either my work plan and assignment or that of our other departments. As I recall, the Citizens Academy is one that did not initially appear formally in either my work plan or that of our other departments. Having said that, I think the mayor did mention it either as part of the comprehensive plan review, and it perhaps came up during the budget process. And we as staff do recognize that that is a tool that localities are using to cultivate interest and knowledge and participation in local government. We had an initial meeting to sort of formulate and begin conceptualizing about how we would pursue that and what resources would be required. But much of the executive leadership and intellectual capacity that's needed to move that particular initiative forward has been applied to other opportunities. And so I would have to tell you in all candor, that one is not making much progress to achievement. The abandoned vehicles and community development, I'll provide a more full report, but we're taking steps to implement those items as quickly as we can with the resources we have available, and responding to a couple of unforeseen challenges and impediments. So.
Okay, great, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I have one more thing. That was kind of weighing on my mind, so I was distracted. So I would like, and I've received a recommendation from the police department that we donate an asset that we would plan to take out of our fleet, and this is Vehicle 7013.
One of my
It's known to us, 7013. It may be a favorite among the organization. But that is a 2011 Ford Crown Vic. It has 115,000 miles on it, and it is scheduled for rotation out of service with the department. In communication that we've had with the Middle River Regional Jail, they have a need for a resource like this to conduct local transports where if you have an inmate, say, that needs to go to the doctor or have an appointment, these are vehicles that would be used locally. We tend to have larger and over-the-road vehicles for longer transport, but we seem to be short at the jail for a vehicle that might not be excuse me, well suited for long travel. And so it would be my recommendation that we honor the request of the jail and transfer this asset to them as sort of a mutual partner type arrangement, if that's okay with the council. Okay. Thank you.
Got a lot of head nodding over here. So.
That's all I have, sir.
Great, thank you. Next is citizen comment period.
Excuse me for 1 second. Mr. Danny McCormick.
Mr. McCormick, if you wouldn't mind stating your name, address for the record, and then these three little lights are going to come on. Green is go, yellow's it's almost up, and then red if you would conclude your comments after that. Thank you.
My name's Danny McCormick. Live at 200 Edward Avenue here in the city. Thank you for having us time for citizens talk. I have concern about the not the museum itself. I'm for the museum, but the parking lot down there, it used to be called Advanced Parking Lot. If you lived here long in the city, you know what I'm talking about. It's going to take up a lot of that parking lot. And it's used a lot, like for the Fall Forge Art Show. It's packed. Other things, fire department auction. Fire department uses it for training. The rescue squad uses it for stuff they have going on in their building. The Chili Blues, the River Fest, it's all kinds of stuff. And you take that away, a lot of that parking, where's people going to park? Because you always want to draw people to the city. I know the museum's going to draw a lot of people, but you don't want to take away from them events either. I just have some, concerns about it. So, thank you.
Great, thank you very much.
Mr. Grayson Comer.
Mr. Comer, advance the podium. Again, your name and address for the record, and then same thing with the timer there. Appreciate it. If you give your name and address for the record, and then the green light will come on. That's go, and yellow is.
I'm sorry, I don't hear too good.
Okay. If you could state your name and address for the record, and then these little timers on here. Green is go, yellow is to kind of wrap up, and then red is if you could conclude your comments.
Gotcha.
Thank you.
My name is Grayson Comer, C-O-M-E-R. The wife and I moved to Waynesboro 54 years ago. Although we live in the county at this particular moment, we still consider ourselves Waynesborans. I wanted to discuss the gay club, if you will, and give you my long-standing opinion. This Impulse Club, I have some photos I'd like to offer. This is the club that's in Charlottesville. This is all the same pictures. I just want everybody to see. As you can see, we're not dealing with a high-end organization. It's a bit of a junk hole, if the truth was known. I can see no reason why Waynesboro would want to lower itself to have this queer club. Excuse my word, but that's what I call it, a queer club. to be established here. It's no reason for it. We don't need it. We don't want it. And if we're lucky enough to be the recipient of the Natural History Museum that's being looked, hopefully, a good possibility that it may come here. We sure don't want a outfit like that, the gay club located close to this museum. That would be a sin. There's a lot of things I could say, but I just think it would be a big mistake to bring that type of people into this nice town. Thank you, sir.
Mr. Fidel Ramirez.
Mr. Ramirez, if you would state your name and address for the record.
Good evening, Mayor and City Council. I came to
I'm sorry, if you can give your name and address for the record.
Fidel Ramirez, 2000 Hampton Drive, Waynesboro, Virginia.
Thank you.
I moved here about 10 years ago, Mayor, and I fell in love with Waynesboro. And I want to just run something real by about me. My wife is a drug and alcohol counselor, family counseling, and AIDS educator. For about 30 years, her and I have been doing street ministry, helping homeless people going through rough times in their life. Once we, not here, but had a transitional home, we used to take people in. Didn't matter who they were, just to help them get on their feet. And the reason I'm telling you this, because I don't want you to think I'm up here as a hater, because we've helped many, many people, including here in Waynesboro. And I have concerns about this club as well. I grew up north, Cleveland, Ohio. Very huge population of gay activities and violence. I myself was a victim of homosexual rape, and I still love the people and I help them. But I want to read here. I'm not going to read it all because there's too much here to read. This is from a report from San Diego University from the Public Health Department. It's about the lesbian and gay bisexual questioning in a university that's done with 15,624 high school students. And in the research, they found to be that they found out that the LGBTQ teens also were at great risk for having used hard drugs compared to the heterosexual children. For instance, heroin 6.6 compared to the other students 1.3. This is going to affect the community, whether you want to address it now or in the future. You're going to address it with this going on. Because last time I was here, I didn't get a chance to sign up. I sat and listened and heard everybody weighing in. And I can't see where you're putting or would allow this club to be put right next to the Boys and Girls Club over here. To me, if I did something like that with children, you and I would be filed with some lawsuits about child abuse. We all know that. The usage of the percentage of illegal drugs, amphetamines, the percentage is like 26.2% compared to the 15.5%. I grew up around this environment. We're seeing it all over the news with the priests. You can't deny what's going on. I grew up with a lot of boys that were in the Catholic diocese that were abused because they got to go somewhere, and it's the youth. And those boys I didn't know that were my friends, it had mental effects on them for being abused like that. I got through it. I got through it. And in my little mind, as an elementary kid getting abused like that,
You could wrap up your comments. We've reached the end of.
okay, I made it through it. A lot of kids ain't gonna make it through
Okay,
it. It
thank
might
you.
be your own.
Thank you for taking the time. Anybody else?
No, sir.
Do we have a closed session this evening?
We do.
Okay.
Mr. Mayor, I move that this meeting be recessed into City Council chambers to reconvene as a closed meeting for the following purposes: for consultation with council pertaining to the actual or probable litigation where such consultation or briefing in an open meeting would be adversely affect the negotiating and litigating posture of the public body, and to receive the advice of counsel on the same. More specifically, to be briefed by the city attorney on matters of potential litigation, and to further receive consultation with counsel under A7, Section 2.2, 3711 of the Freedom of Information Act, Code of Virginia, 1950, as amended.
Is there a second?
Second.
Is there any discussion? Requires a roll call vote, Ms. Bortle?
Mayor Short,
Aye.
Vice Mayor Henderson,
Aye.
Councilman Allen,
Aye.
Councilwoman Anderson,
Aye.
Councilman Hofstadter.
Aye.
We're in closed session. right, is there a motion that we return to open session and certify that only those matters lawfully exempted were heard or discussed?
Mr. Mayor, I move to adopt the following resolution. Whereas the City of Waynesboro has convened a closed meeting on this date pursuant to the affirmative recorded vote in accordance with the provisions of the Freedom of Information Act, and whereas Section 2.2-3712 of Code of Virginia requires certification by City Council to such closed meetings was conducted in conformity with Virginia law. Now, therefore, it is resolved that the City Council of Waynesboro hereby certifies that, to the best of each member's knowledge, 1, only public business matters lawfully exempt from open meeting requirements by Virginia law were discussed in the closed meeting to which the certification resolution applies. 2, only such business matters as were identified in the motion convening the closed meetings were heard, discussed, and considered by Waynesboro City Council. Roll call vote, please.
Okay, is there a second? Could you get a second first?
Second.
Okay, it requires a roll call. Ms. Portal?
Mayor Short,
Aye.
Vice Mayor Henderson,
Aye.
Councilman Allen, Councilwoman Anderson,
Aye.
Councilman Hostetter.
Aye.
We're back in session. Is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Is there a second? Is there a second? Second. Okay, Ms. Henderson, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. We are adjourned.